The grand hall of the palace felt unusually quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting golden patterns across the polished marble floor. The prince sat at his desk, fingers drumming nervously against the mahogany surface. His wife, the princess, stood by the window, gazing out at the gardens where their 3 children played under the watchful eyes of their nannies. For months, they had been carrying a weight that neither could fully express. The pressure of royal life had always been there, hovering like a persistent shadow. But now, with their children growing older and more aware of their unique position in the world, the prince and princess knew they could no longer remain silent about their hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. The princess turned from the window, her elegant blue dress rustling softly. Her eyes met her husband's, and in that moment they both understood what needed to happen. They had spent years living under the microscope of public scrutiny, following protocols that sometimes felt suffocating. But their children deserved something different. They deserved parents who would fight for their happiness, even if it meant challenging centuries of tradition. The prince stood up, walking over to join his wife at the window. Together they watched their eldest daughter, Princess Charlotte, help her younger brother build a castle out of wooden blocks. Their youngest, barely 3 years old, toddled around with a toy horse, completely oblivious to the responsibilities that would one day rest on his small shoulders. The couple had discussed this moment countless times in private. Late at night, when the palace staff had retired and the world outside their bedroom walls felt far away, they would talk about the kind of life they wanted for their children. They spoke of freedom within duty, of happiness alongside responsibility, of normalcy within extraordinary circumstances. The princess remembered her own childhood, growing up with the knowledge that her life would never be entirely her own. She had learned to smile through discomfort, to wave when she felt tired, to represent something larger than herself before she even understood what that meant. The weight of expectation had shaped her in ways both beautiful and painful. Her husband had experienced something similar, though his path had been different. Born into royalty, he had never known anything else. The cameras, the protocols, the endless scrutiny were simply facts of life, but he had also witnessed the toll it took on those he loved. He had seen how the relentless pressure could break even the strongest spirits. Neither of them wanted their children to experience that same crushing weight without support, without understanding, without a voice in their own destiny. The decision to speak publicly about their children's future had not come easily. The royal family had always maintained a certain distance from the press, revealing only what was necessary and keeping their true feelings carefully guarded. To break that silence was to risk criticism, to invite speculation, to open themselves up to judgment from millions of people who felt they had a right to an opinion about their private lives. But the prince and princess had reached a point where silence felt more dangerous than honesty. They had watched their children begin to ask questions that deserved thoughtful answers. Why do people always take our pictures? Why can't we go to the park like other children? Why do we have to dress a certain way and speak a certain way and behave a certain way all the time? These innocent questions had cut through their hearts like knives. Their children were beginning to understand that they were different, that their lives would follow a path already carved out before they were even born. The prince and princess wanted to be honest with them, to help them understand their heritage while also fighting to protect their childhood for as long as possible. The princess placed her hand gently on the window glass, her palm leaving a brief misty impression. She thought about the interview they had scheduled for the following week. A trusted journalist would sit with them in one of the palace's more intimate drawing rooms, and for the first time, they would speak openly about their hopes for their children's royal future. They would talk about wanting their children to have choices, even within the constraints of their position. They would discuss the importance of mental health, of emotional well-being, of creating a family environment where their children felt safe, expressing their true feelings. They would address the toxic elements of public attention and how they planned to shield their children from the worst of it. The prince wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. They stood together, watching their children play, drawing strength from each other's presence. This would not be an easy journey. There would be critics who thought they were being too modern, too rebellious, too protective. There would be traditionalists who believed the royal family should remain silent and stoic, that personal feelings should be subordinated to duty. But the prince and princess had made their choice. They would speak their truth, share their vision, and fight for their children's right to happiness within the framework of royal responsibility. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the royal couple remained at the window, silently preparing themselves for the moment when their private hopes would become public knowledge. Their children's laughter drifted up from the gardens, innocent and pure, a reminder of exactly what they were fighting to protect. The world was about to hear their story, their truth, their dreams for the next generation of royalty, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The preparation for the interview consumed the following days. The prince and princess knew that every word they spoke would be analyzed, interpreted, and debated across the globe. They needed to be honest but also careful. They wanted to be open but not reckless. The balance felt impossibly delicate. The princess sat in her private study, reviewing notes she had written over the past months. Pages and pages of thoughts, feelings, observations about what she wanted for her children. She had documented moments that broke her heart, like the time her eldest daughter had asked why people shouted questions at them when they were just trying to walk from the car to a building. She had written about her son's confusion when he realized that his friends at school had freedoms he could never enjoy. Her husband joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one down beside her papers and took a seat across from her. They had always been a team, but this moment required an even deeper level of partnership. They needed to speak with one voice while honoring both of their perspectives. The prince had his own concerns to share. He worried about the burden of expectation that would fall on their eldest child. He knew what it felt like to be constantly compared to previous generations, to have every action measured against an impossible standard of perfection. He wanted his children to understand their history and heritage, but he also wanted them to forge their own paths. They discussed the topics they would address in the interview. Education was paramount. The royal couple believed strongly in giving their children the best possible education, not just academically, but emotionally and socially as well. They wanted their children to learn about the world beyond palace walls, to understand different perspectives, to develop empathy and compassion. The princess spoke passionately about mental health. She had struggled herself with the pressures of royal life, particularly in the early years of her marriage. The constant scrutiny, the criticism, the feeling of never being good enough had taken its toll. She had learned, through therapy and support, how to navigate these challenges. Now she wanted to ensure her children had those tools from the beginning. They would talk about privacy, about the line between public duty and private family life. The prince and princess understood that their children would have public roles to play, but they also believed those children deserved spaces where they could simply be themselves. Birthday parties without photographers lurking outside. School plays where they could perform without worrying about headlines the next day. Moments of childhood that belonged only to them and their family. The couple spent hours refining their message. They wrote and rewrote key phrases, making sure they conveyed both strength and vulnerability. They wanted to show that being royal did not mean being superhuman. Their children would make mistakes, have bad days, struggle with challenges like any other young people. The difference was that their struggles would likely play out in public, and the prince and princess wanted to prepare them for that reality, while also fighting to minimize its impact. The royal advisors were nervous about the interview. Some counseled against it entirely, arguing that the monarchy had always thrived on mystique and distance. Opening up too much, they warned, could diminish the royal family's special status. Others worried about specific topics, urging the couple to avoid anything controversial or potentially divisive. But the prince and princess had made up their minds. They listened respectfully to the advice, considered the concerns, and then decided to move forward with their plan. This was about their children's future, and they would not be swayed by fear or tradition. The princess thought about her own parents and how they had navigated raising children in the public eye. She had learned valuable lessons from their experiences, both positive and negative. She wanted to honor what had worked while also having the courage to do things differently when necessary. Progress, she believed, required evolution. The prince reflected on the legacy of his family, stretching back generations. He felt the weight of history, the responsibility of continuity, but he also recognized that each generation had to adapt to its time. The world his children were growing up in was vastly different from the one he had known as a child. Social media, instant global communication, changing attitudes about privilege and responsibility, All of these factors shaped how his children would experience royal life. They decided to include specific examples in their interview, real moments from their family life that would help people understand their perspective. The princess would share a story about her daughter asking to have a sleepover at a friend's house, something so simple and normal, yet complicated by security concerns and protocol. The prince would talk about teaching his son to ride a bicycle in the palace gardens, trying to create a sense of normalcy in a fundamentally abnormal situation. As the interview date approached, the couple felt both nervous and relieved. Nervous because they were about to make themselves vulnerable in a way royal family members rarely did. Relieved because they were finally going to express feelings and hopes they had kept bottled up for too long. The night before the interview, they sat together in their private sitting room. The children were asleep upstairs, unaware that the next day would mark a turning point in how the world understood their family. The prince and princess held hands, drawing strength from their partnership. They talked about the risks they were taking. There would be criticism, certainly. Some would accuse them of complaining about a life of privilege. Others would say they were being too soft, that royal children needed to learn duty above all else. The tabloids would dissect every word, looking for controversy and conflict. But they also talked about the potential rewards. If they could start a conversation about how to raise children in extraordinary circumstances while prioritizing their well-being, that would be worthwhile. If they could inspire other families, royal or not, to think more carefully about balancing expectations with happiness, that would be meaningful. If they could give their own children a sense that their parents were fighting for them, that would be everything. The princess looked at the photograph on the mantel, a casual family picture taken during a holiday. Her children's faces glowed with genuine happiness, caught in a moment of pure joy. That was what she wanted to protect. Not the formal portraits that would hang in museums, not the carefully staged public appearances, but those authentic moments of childhood wonder and delight. Tomorrow, they would begin to share their vision with the world. Tonight, they simply sat together, two parents who loved their children and were willing to challenge centuries of tradition to give them the best possible future. The morning of the interview arrived with a gentle spring breeze flowing through the palace windows. The princess had barely slept, running through possible questions and responses in her mind throughout the night. The prince had been up since dawn, reviewing his notes one final time in his study. They met for breakfast with their children, maintaining their normal routine despite the significance of the day ahead. Their eldest daughter noticed something different in her parents' demeanor. At 8 years old, she was perceptive enough to sense when important things were happening, even if she did not fully understand them. She asked if everything was all right, and the princess smiled, kissing her forehead and assuring her that everything was fine. They would talk to her about the interview later, explaining it in terms a child could understand. The interview was scheduled for late morning in the blue drawing room, a space that balanced formality with intimacy. The journalist chosen for this conversation was someone both the prince and princess trusted, a veteran reporter known for thoughtful questions and fair reporting. The camera crew set up their equipment discreetly, trying to create an atmosphere that felt more like a conversation between friends than a formal media event. As the prince and princess walked into the room together, they presented a united front. They had chosen their clothing carefully, formal enough to show respect for the occasion but not so rigid as to create distance. The princess wore a soft cream dress, elegant but approachable. The prince wore a navy suit, professional but relaxed. The journalist greeted them warmly, and after a few minutes of preliminary conversation to ease the tension, the cameras began rolling. The first question was gentle, asking them to talk about their children in general terms. The prince spoke first, his voice warm with paternal pride. He described his eldest as thoughtful and creative, his middle child as energetic and curious, his youngest as affectionate and joyful. The princess added her own observations, painting a picture of 3 distinct personalities, each bringing something special to their family. Then the journalist moved to more substantive territory. What did they hope for their children's future? How did they envision their roles as young royals in a changing world? The princess took a deep breath and began to speak from her heart. She talked about wanting her children to understand the privilege of their position, but also the responsibility that came with it. She wanted them to use their platform to make a positive difference in the world, to champion causes they cared about, to be voices for those who struggled to be heard. But she also wanted them to have joy. She wanted them to experience friendship without wondering if people liked them for themselves or for their titles. She wanted them to pursue interests and passions without every hobby being turned into a public spectacle. She wanted them to make mistakes and learn from them without those mistakes being broadcast across international media. The prince built on his wife's words, discussing the importance of mental health and emotional well-being. He spoke candidly about his own struggles with the pressure of public life, how he had learned over time to develop coping mechanisms and support systems. He wanted his children to have those resources from the beginning, not to have to discover them through painful experience. He talked about therapy, about the importance of having someone to talk to who was not part of the royal system. He mentioned mindfulness practices, physical exercise, creative outlets. These things were not weaknesses, he emphasized, but essential tools for maintaining balance in an inherently unbalanced situation. The journalist asked about privacy, about where they drew the line between public duty and private family life. This was clearly a topic both the prince and princess felt strongly about. The princess explained that while they understood their children had public roles, they believed those roles should be introduced gradually and appropriately for their ages. She spoke about the challenge of raising children in the age of social media, where every image could be shared and commented on within seconds. She and her husband had made decisions about limiting their children's exposure, about controlling when and how photographs were taken and distributed. Some had criticized these decisions as being too protective, but the princess stood firm. Her children's childhoods were precious and finite, and she would not apologize for trying to preserve them. The prince added that they wanted to raise their children with an understanding of the world beyond privilege. They discussed the importance of exposing their children to different experiences, different people, different realities. Charity work was not just about appearances or fulfilling duties, but about genuinely connecting with others and understanding the varied human experience. He shared a story about taking his eldest daughter to a community center where she met children from very different backgrounds. The experience had made a profound impression on her. She had asked questions for days afterward, processing what she had seen and learned. Those were the kinds of experiences they wanted to continue providing, opportunities for their children to develop empathy and perspective. The conversation turned to education. Both the prince and princess believed strongly in comprehensive education that went beyond traditional academics. They wanted their children to learn languages, to understand history from multiple perspectives, to develop critical thinking skills, but they also wanted them to learn practical life skills, to understand how most people in the world lived and worked. The princess mentioned that she sometimes felt torn between preparing her children for their royal roles and allowing them to simply be children. It was a constant balancing act, and she admitted there were days when she questioned whether they were getting it right. But she and her husband talked regularly about their approach, adjusted when necessary, and always kept their children's well-being as the primary consideration. The journalist asked a difficult question about public criticism and how they dealt with negative commentary about their family. The prince's expression grew more serious. He acknowledged that criticism came with the territory, but he drew a clear distinction between fair reporting and harmful invasion of privacy. He spoke about the toll that tabloid coverage could take, not just on adults but especially on children. He and his wife were committed to protecting their children from the worst of it, to creating a home environment where they felt safe and valued regardless of what headlines might say. They taught their children not to read or pay attention to media coverage, to understand that people who did not know them personally could not truly judge them. The princess added that they were also teaching their children resilience, because they knew the scrutiny would only increase as their children grew older. But resilience did not mean accepting abuse or intrusion. It meant having a strong sense of self, secure relationships, and the confidence to know their own worth independent of public opinion. As the interview continued, the prince and princess grew more comfortable, their words flowing more naturally. They laughed together, recounting funny moments from family life. They became emotional, discussing the challenges they had faced. They showed themselves as real people, parents who loved their children and were doing their best to navigate an extraordinary situation. The final question brought everything full circle. What did they most want people to understand about their children and their hopes for the future? The princess answered first, her voice clear and strong. She wanted people to remember that her children were, above all else, children. They deserved the same compassion, the same grace, the same space to grow and develop that any child deserved. Their royal status was one aspect of who they were, but it was not the totality of their identity. The prince concluded by saying that he and his wife were committed to raising kind, compassionate, capable individuals who understood both their privilege and their responsibility. They would support their children in whatever paths they chose to follow, within the framework of their royal duties. Most importantly, they would love them unconditionally and create a family environment where that love was the foundation of everything else. As the cameras stopped rolling, the prince and princess felt as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. They had said what needed to be said, shared what needed to be shared. Now they would wait to see how the world responded. The interview aired 3 days later on a Thursday evening. The prince and princess watched it together in their private quarters, holding hands as they saw themselves on screen speaking so openly about their hopes and fears. Hearing their own words played back was strange, almost surreal. They had said those things, expressed those feelings, but seeing it broadcast to millions of viewers made it feel suddenly more real and permanent. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, reactions began flooding in from around the world. Social media exploded with commentary, both supportive and critical. News outlets rushed to analyze every statement, every gesture, every expression captured by the cameras. The interview became the most talked about event in months, dominating headlines and conversations from London to New York to Sydney. The responses were, as expected, deeply divided. Many people responded with overwhelming support and admiration. Parents from all walks of life expressed appreciation for the royal couple's honesty about the challenges of raising children under intense scrutiny. Mental health advocates praised their willingness to discuss therapy and emotional well-being openly, helping to reduce stigma around these important topics. Social media filled with messages from people sharing their own struggles with balancing family privacy and public expectations. Teachers commented on the importance of the educational philosophy the prince and princess described. Child development experts applauded their age-appropriate approach to introducing their children to public roles. One particularly moving response came from a mother who had lost her own privacy due to circumstances beyond her control. She wrote an open letter thanking the princess for articulating what so many parents felt but struggled to express. The letter went viral, shared thousands of times by people who saw their own experiences reflected in the royal couple's words. However, the criticism was equally vocal and, in some cases, harsh. Traditional royalists felt the interview was inappropriate, arguing that the monarchy should maintain distance and mystique. They believed that by speaking so personally about family matters, the prince and princess were diminishing the institution they represented. Some commentators accused them of seeking sympathy despite their privileged position. Several newspaper columnists wrote scathing pieces suggesting the couple was being overly sensitive and protective. One particularly brutal headline asked if the royal children were being raised to be too soft for the roles they would eventually need to fill. Another opinion piece questioned whether the prince and princess understood the duties they had been born or married into. The tabloids, predictably, focused on controversy and conflict. They searched for contradictions in the couple's statements, compared their words to previous royal family members' approaches, and speculated about tensions within the broader royal household. Unnamed palace sources were quoted suggesting that senior family members were displeased with how candid the interview had been. The prince tried not to read the coverage, but it was impossible to completely avoid. His staff briefed him on the major themes emerging in the response. He felt frustrated by some of the mischaracterizations of what he and his wife had said. They had not been complaining about their lives or seeking pity. They had simply been honest about the challenges of raising children in unique circumstances. The princess struggled more with the negative reactions. Despite knowing that criticism would come, seeing it in print and on screen still hurt. She worried about whether they had done the right thing, whether their desire to protect their children had somehow backfired and created more attention and pressure instead. Her husband reassured her that they had made the right choice. The conversation needed to happen, and they had the courage to start it. Not everyone would agree with their approach, and that was okay. What mattered was that they were being true to their values and their commitment to their children. In the days following the broadcast, Several prominent figures spoke out in support of the royal couple. A famous child psychologist appeared on a morning talk show to discuss the interview, praising the prince and princess for prioritizing their children's mental health and well-being. A former politician who had raised children in the public eye wrote an editorial about the unique challenges they faced and the bravery required to speak openly about them. Letters poured into the palace from regular people, sharing their own stories. A father wrote about how the interview had inspired him to have more open conversations with his own children about their feelings. A teacher described using excerpts from the interview to discuss empathy and compassion with her students. A young person who had grown up in a similar situation thanked them for addressing issues that had affected her own childhood. The couple's closest friends reached out privately with messages of support. They knew how difficult the decision to do the interview had been, and how vulnerable it made the prince and princess feel. These personal connections helped sustain them through the storm of public reaction. Within the broader royal family, responses were complicated. Some members understood and supported what the prince and princess were trying to achieve. Others felt uncomfortable with such personal revelations, preferring the traditional approach of quiet dignity and minimal disclosure. Family dinners became slightly tense, with certain topics carefully avoided to prevent conflict. The prince and princess's children remained largely unaware of the full extent of the reaction to the interview. Their parents had explained in simple terms that they had talked to a journalist about being a family and why they loved their children so much. The eldest asked a few questions about why this was important, and her mother explained that sometimes grown-ups need to talk about their feelings so that other people can understand them better. As the initial frenzy began to settle, a more nuanced conversation emerged. Thoughtful commentators started discussing the broader implications of what the prince and princess had said. Articles explored changing expectations of the monarchy in modern times. Debates arose about how public figures should balance duty with personal well-being. Some royal watchers noted that this interview might represent a generational shift in how the monarchy engaged with the public. Younger people, particularly, seemed to appreciate the authenticity and vulnerability the prince and princess had shown. Polls indicated strong support among parents and those under 40, while older generations were more divided. The prince received an unexpected letter from a distant royal relative who had faced similar challenges decades earlier. The letter, written in careful handwriting on expensive stationery, expressed admiration for the courage it took to speak so openly. The older relative shared her own regrets about staying silent during difficult times, suggesting that the prince and princess's approach might spare their children some of the pain her family had experienced. This letter meant more to the couple than any positive headline. It affirmed that they were not alone in recognizing the need for change, that even within traditional structures, there was understanding and support for evolution. The princess began to feel more confident about their decision. Yes, there had been criticism, but there had also been meaningful connection. They had started conversations in households around the world about family, privacy, mental health, and the balance between duty and happiness. If their vulnerability helped even a few families communicate more openly or protect their children more effectively, then the risk had been worth it. The prince observed that the interview had also changed something within their own family dynamic. They had articulated their values and priorities so clearly that it gave them a framework for future decisions. When questions arose about their children's schedules, public appearances, or media access, they could refer back to the principles they had expressed in the interview. As the second week after the broadcast drew to a close, the intense media attention began to shift to other stories. The prince and princess settled back into their normal routines, grateful for the return to relative calm. They had weathered the storm together, and their partnership felt stronger for it. The world now knew what they hoped for their children's future. The conversation had been started, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same honesty and courage they had shown in breaking their silence. In the months following the interview, the prince and princess began to translate their words into concrete actions. Speaking about their hopes for their children's future had been important, but now they needed to demonstrate their commitment through real changes in how they approached royal life and parenting. The first significant shift came in how they managed their children's public appearances. Rather than following a schedule determined primarily by tradition and royal protocol, they developed a more thoughtful approach based on their children's ages, comfort levels, and the specific nature of each event. Their eldest daughter, now more aware of her role, participated in carefully selected engagements where she could make meaningful contributions rather than simply being displayed. The princess worked closely with the palace communications team to establish clearer boundaries around photography and media access. She insisted that her children's school events remain private spaces, free from press intrusion. Sports days, concerts, and parent-teacher conferences were family matters, not public spectacles. Some media outlets grumbled about restricted access, but most parents watching from around the world understood and approved. The prince took an active role in his children's education beyond simply selecting schools. He regularly attended school functions, not for photo opportunities but as a genuinely engaged father. He helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, and took a particular interest in ensuring his children received education that went beyond traditional subjects. He arranged for them to meet people from diverse backgrounds, exposing them to different perspectives and experiences. One particularly meaningful initiative involved the children spending time with young people involved in various charitable organizations. Rather than formal visits where his children were passive observers, the prince arranged for more interactive experiences. His eldest daughter spent an afternoon baking with children from a community center, simply being part of the group rather than the center of attention. His middle child joined a conservation project where everyone worked together, royal status temporarily forgotten in the shared purpose of planting trees. The princess championed mental health initiatives with renewed vigor, inspired by the positive response to her comments about emotional well-being. She worked with experts to develop age-appropriate resources for talking to children about their feelings. She established a routine in her own family of regular check-ins, where each child could share something that made them happy, something that worried them, and something they were looking forward to. These simple conversations created a foundation of open communication. The royal couple also made changes to their children's daily routines to incorporate more normalcy. They arranged playdates with school friends at the palace, working with security to create a welcoming environment that did not feel intimidating or overly formal. The princess personally oversaw modifications to parts of the palace gardens where her children could play more freely, creating spaces that felt less like historic monuments and more like a real home. They implemented a rule about technology and media consumption, teaching their children to be thoughtful about what they saw online, while also protecting them from harmful content about themselves or their family. The eldest daughter was not allowed to search for her own name or look at social media posts about the royal family. The prince and princess wanted their children to develop their sense of identity based on their real experiences and relationships, not on public perception. Education about their heritage and role was approached gradually and honestly. The prince and his wife created age-appropriate ways to help their children understand their family history, the institution they were part of, and the responsibilities they would one day assume. This was not about pressure or expectation, but about providing context and understanding. They used stories, visits to historic sites, and conversations with family members to build this knowledge naturally over time. The princess introduced her children to her own childhood experiences, sharing both the positive aspects and the challenges she had faced. She wanted them to understand that she truly comprehended what their lives might be like, because she had lived through something similar herself. This created a bond of shared experience and mutual understanding that gave her children confidence that their mother truly understood them. The couple also worked to strengthen their children's sibling relationships, understanding that these bonds would be crucial support systems throughout their lives. They created family traditions that were just for the five of them, special rituals that had nothing to do with royal duty or public expectation. Sunday afternoons became family time, protected from all but the most urgent interruptions. They would play games, watch movies, or simply talk, creating memories rooted in genuine connection rather than formal obligation. One of the most significant changes involved how the prince and princess approached their own work-life balance. They had spoken in the interview about prioritizing family, and now they demonstrated that commitment by adjusting their schedules. They turned down some engagements to be present for important family moments. They staggered their travel so that at least one parent was always home with the children. They made it clear to their staff that bedtime with their children was sacred, not to be interrupted except in genuine emergencies. This approach raised some eyebrows among traditionalists who believed royal duty should always come first. But the prince and princess held firm. They were teaching their children that family mattered, that relationships required attention and care, and that being present for the people you love was not a weakness, but a strength. They believed these lessons would ultimately make their children better, more emotionally healthy individuals, who could fulfill their royal roles more effectively. The royal couple also became more selective about which royal traditions they maintained and which they were willing to modify or abandon. Some protocols existed for good reasons and helped maintain the dignity and significance of the monarchy. Others were simply outdated customs that served no real purpose beyond being the way things had always been done. The prince and princess carefully evaluated each tradition, keeping what had value and letting go of what did not. For example, they maintained formal state occasions with all appropriate ceremony and protocol. Their children learned to conduct themselves properly during these events, because they represented something larger than themselves. But they eliminated some of the more arcane rules about children's behavior in private family settings. At home, their children could be loud, playful, and messy, just like children everywhere. The princess worked with child development experts to better understand how to prepare her children for the unique pressures they would face. She learned about building resilience, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and fostering strong self-esteem. She brought these insights into her parenting, consciously creating an environment where her children felt valued for who they were as individuals, not just for their titles or positions. The prince initiated conversations within the broader royal family about adapting to changing times. Not everyone agreed with his perspective, but he made the case that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to evolve. Younger generations increasingly valued authenticity, transparency, and emotional intelligence. If the royal family could not adapt to these changing values, their relevance would continue to decline. As autumn arrived, bringing cooler weather and changing leaves, the prince and princess could see tangible results from the changes they had implemented. Their children seemed happier, more grounded, more secure in themselves. The eldest daughter, who had been showing signs of anxiety about her future role, appeared more confident and settled. The middle child, always energetic and curious, seemed to better understand the balance between being himself and meeting certain expectations. The youngest remained blissfully unaware of most of the complexity, but was growing up in an environment that prioritized emotional health from the beginning. The couple received feedback from teachers, friends, and even extended family members commenting on positive changes they observed in the children. The young royals were developing into thoughtful, empathetic individuals who understood their privilege but also demonstrated genuine care for others. They were learning that their positions brought not just attention and advantage, but responsibility and opportunity to make a positive difference. The prince and princess knew their work was far from finished. Their children would continue to grow and face new challenges. Public scrutiny would intensify as they got older. Difficult situations would arise that would test everything they had tried to build. But they felt confident that they were creating a strong foundation. They were giving their children tools, support, and most importantly, the knowledge that their parents would always prioritize their well-being while helping them fulfill their destinies. A year had passed since the interview that changed everything. The prince and princess sat together on a bench in the palace gardens, watching their children play in the late afternoon sun. The scene was peaceful, ordinary in many ways, yet profound in its significance. This simple family moment represented everything they had been fighting to protect and preserve. Their eldest daughter had just turned 9, and the changes in her were remarkable. She moved through the world with greater confidence now, still aware of her unique position but no longer burdened by it in the same way. She had learned that being royal did not mean being perfect, that making mistakes was part of growing up, and that her parents would love and support her regardless of any missteps she might take. Just that morning, she had come to breakfast with an idea for a project she wanted to develop for her school. She wanted to organize a charity drive to collect books for children who did not have access to libraries. The princess had listened carefully as her daughter explained her thinking, asking thoughtful questions and helping her plan without taking over the project. This was exactly the kind of initiative they wanted to encourage, their daughter using her position and resources to help others, driven by genuine compassion rather than obligation. The middle child had found his confidence through sports and outdoor activities. The prince had noticed how physical challenges helped his son process emotions and build resilience. They had developed a routine of weekend hikes together, just father and son, talking about everything from school friendships to future dreams. During these walks away from palace walls and watching eyes, his son could be completely himself. The youngest was still delightfully oblivious to most of the complexities that surrounded his life. At 4 years old, he lived in a world of imagination and play. The prince and princess were determined to preserve his innocence for as long as possible, knowing that awareness of his position would come soon enough. For now, he was simply their baby, full of giggles and endless energy. The broader impact of the interview and the changes the royal couple had implemented extended far beyond their immediate family. Other royal families around the world had begun adopting similar approaches, speaking more openly about mental health and the challenges of raising children in the public eye. The conversation the prince and princess had started had rippled outward, changing how people thought about modern monarchy and family life under scrutiny. The princess had received invitations to speak at conferences about child well-being, mental health, and family privacy in the digital age. She selected engagements carefully, focusing on platforms where she could make meaningful contributions rather than simply lending her name for publicity. She became a genuine advocate, using her experience and position to drive real change in how society approached these critical issues. The prince had deepened his work with organizations supporting young people's mental health. He shared his own experiences more freely now, talking about the pressure he had felt growing up and how he had learned to manage it. Young people responded to his honesty, and the organizations he supported saw increased engagement and reduced stigma around seeking help. Within the palace walls, the culture had shifted noticeably. Staff members observed that the family seemed happier, more relaxed. The children laughed more freely, felt comfortable expressing their opinions, and showed genuine affection toward their parents in ways that previous generations of royal children might have hidden. This emotional openness did not diminish their ability to perform their public roles. If anything, it enhanced it. They appeared more genuine, more relatable, more human. The royal couple had also strengthened their relationship through this journey. Speaking publicly about their hopes and fears had required them to be completely honest with each other first. They had examined their own childhoods, their traumas and joys, their fears and aspirations. This deep exploration had brought them closer together, forging a partnership based not just on duty and compatibility, but on profound understanding and shared purpose. They had learned to navigate disagreements about parenting decisions with respect and compromise. Sometimes the prince wanted to be more protective, while the princess pushed for more exposure to prepare their children for their future roles. Other times their positions reversed. They had developed a system of checking in with each other, discussing their reasoning, and finding middle ground that honored both perspectives. The public's perception of the royal family had evolved as well. Opinion polls showed increasing support, particularly among younger demographics who appreciated the authenticity and vulnerability the prince and princess had demonstrated. The monarchy felt more relevant, more connected to contemporary values and concerns. This was not about abandoning tradition or dignity, but about adapting those timeless institutions to remain meaningful in a changing world. There had been setbacks and challenges along the way. A tabloid had published an invasive story about one of the children that violated the boundaries the royal couple had tried to establish. The resulting legal action and public response had been stressful, but it had also clarified the lines they were willing to defend. The message was clear. Their children deserved protection and they would fight for it. Some family members had remained skeptical of their approach. Generational differences in perspective were natural, and the prince and princess accepted that not everyone would agree with their choices. They maintained respectful relationships while staying true to their values, demonstrating to their children that it was possible to disagree with loved ones while still maintaining connection and care. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in warm golden light, the princess reflected on how far they had come. A year ago, they had been terrified about speaking publicly, worried about judgment and criticism, uncertain if they were making the right choice. Now, looking at their happy, healthy children, She knew beyond any doubt that breaking their silence had been the right decision. The prince squeezed his wife's hand, his thoughts running parallel to hers. They had changed the conversation around royal parenting and children's well-being. They had demonstrated that it was possible to honor tradition while also prioritizing mental health and emotional development. They had shown their children that their feelings mattered, that their happiness was important, that they were loved unconditionally. Their eldest daughter ran over, her face flushed from playing. She climbed onto the bench between her parents, comfortable and secure in their presence. She chattered excitedly about her day, about her friends, about her book project idea. The prince and princess listened attentively, asking questions, offering encouragement, simply being present. This was the future they had envisioned. Not a future where their children were perfect royal specimens, flawless in their execution of duty, but a future where they were complete human beings, capable of fulfilling their roles while also maintaining their sense of self, their emotional health, their capacity for joy and genuine connection. The younger children joined them on the bench, creating a happy, jumbled pile of family affection. They sat together as the light faded, in no hurry to return to the palace and the formal routines that awaited them there. This moment belonged to just the five of them, a private treasure in their very public lives. The prince and princess knew that challenges would continue to arise. Their children would face difficulties as they grew older, would struggle with aspects of their roles, would sometimes resent the limitations placed upon their lives. But they also knew their children would face these challenges with resources, support, and emotional tools that previous generations had often lacked. They had built a foundation of open communication, unconditional love, and honest acknowledgement of both privilege and burden. They had created a family culture where feelings could be expressed, struggles could be shared, and support was always available. Most importantly, they had shown their children through words and actions that being royal was only one part of who they were, not the entirety of their identity. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the royal family finally made their way back inside. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new challenges, new moments requiring the careful balance between public duty and private family life. But tonight had been perfect in its simplicity, a testament to everything they had worked to achieve. The prince and princess had broken their silence, revealed their hopes, and fought to shape a different kind of royal future for their children. The journey was far from over, but looking at their happy, healthy children, they felt confident they were heading in the right direction. They had given their children the greatest gift they could offer, a childhood built on love, support, and the freedom to become themselves within the context of their extraordinary circumstances. The story of this royal family would continue to unfold over years and decades to come. But this chapter, the one where two parents found the courage to speak their truth and fight for their children's well-being, would always be remembered as the moment everything changed. They had proven that even within ancient institutions bound by tradition and protocol, there was room for evolution, for compassion, for putting children's needs at the center of every decision. As they tucked